Hello, everyone. Today we are talking about early medieval Europe, and we're going to talk about Franks and Carolingians, and the most important ruler of this period is Charlemagne. So I'm going to begin by reminding us of, in the previous lecture, I sort of set up this framework that some of the take-home points when we're talking about medieval Europe, I think, are these. We're talking about the localization of power, political fragmentation. We're talking about the spread of Christianity. We're talking about authority shared between church and state. And also, we're talking about the formation of a European identity. In this lecture, were the two aspects of medieval Europe that we're pausing on primarily are this fragmentation, localization of political power, and also this component aspect of authority shared between the church and state. And I mentioned last time this idea of a medieval synthesis, seeing a society emerging that is based in these three pillars of Greco-Roman tradition, Germanic traditions, and Latin Christianity. Or perhaps I should say Christianity. We could talk about that. At any rate, if I were going to ask the question at some point on an essay or whatnot, how did the church become so powerful in medieval Europe? I think that some of the components of that answer would include political fragmentation, patronage, and also Eastern politics, a preoccupation with wars in the East that forced Rome to look north for help. So I'll be kind of vague and not fully elaborate, but maybe listen to what I'm saying and the dynamics I'm describing with that question in mind, and whether you think that might be a good answer, how you might elaborate it, or a somewhat incomplete answer that you might want to develop with additional parts of it. At any rate, in the wake of Rome that had extended all the way through Gaul being now what we call France in large part, and up even into the continent of England, where there some aqueducts are built in Bath, England. In the wake of the demise of the Roman Empire, there was no central rule and authority, and power became much more localized. We talked about the civil wars. We talked about Germanic barbarians perhaps doing the bidding of Roman generals, establishing themselves as warlords, as opposed to doing service to a centralized imperial Roman state. And so power no longer derives from Rome and in Roman law necessarily. It derives from other places. And those places are things like kinship networks, the patronage of the church. The church becomes very powerful. Individual royal courts are established, and at some level, wealth. Is this a world where might makes right, where people could gain land and gain wealth through plunder, and then they became more powerful as a result of that. Now, one of the first kings, traditionally we so often think of order our history in terms of from reign to reign, from one political ruler to the next, and there's so much more to tell about. There's so many more ways to tell the history of humanity, but organizing around kings and reigns can be useful hooks. So I'll start out by talking about Clovis. Clovis emerges as one of the first Frankish kings. The first Frankish king to convert to Latin Christianity. He was probably persuaded by his wife Clotilda that his success in battle had been due to the Christian God. And in some ways that's kind of typical. Women were also often the bearers of faith, teaching the rules of the faith, and also in royal courts doing the work of doing the spiritual work of acting in ways that would curry the favor, God's favor. Now, Clovis, so Clovis is a very successful battle warrior. He moves into southern Gaul. He overthrows the Visigoths. With the support, he's made some alliances with armies over in the Eastern Emperor, and the permission to act, so to speak, of the Eastern Emperor. Not that the Eastern Emperor has all this authority to really give permission, but if you'll remember from our previous maps that they had sort of, the East had kind of reclawed a huge part of the territory that had even what we would have considered the Western Roman Empire, as things in Rome have really gone downhill. So he's operating with the support of the Eastern Emperor, and from this, and it's from Clovis that we start to call, who's a Frankish ruler, this territory starts to be called France instead of Gaul. And Clovis he has himself crowned nonetheless with a Romanesque diadem. We consider Clovis the founder or first major leader of the Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingian dynasty lasts from about the 5th to the 8th century. And legend tells us that, supposedly the founder of the dynasty is Merovich, but Clovis is the first actual person we see in the historical record. Legend had it that his grandfather was a sea dragon. And this speaks to some extent about the relations between humans and animals in the pagan pre-Christian world. Back in Roman and Greek mythology, we see a lot of kind of interaction between the gods and the humans, and shape changing and whatnot. Shape changing is a component of a lot of animistic faiths. And so it shouldn't totally surprise us that one of this early Frankish king thought that or legend told it that he was the son of a sea dragon. A world where in this animistic, it invokes again this animistic traditions where the boundaries between the human and the animal worlds were nowhere near as complete as they would become, especially when we had a better understanding of science, etc. And it also tells us, though quite practically, that we don't really know who his grandfather was. At any rate, Clovis converts to Roman Christianity, and we say he's the first Christian king. But one thing to know is that even from the 400s, other Germanic groups, namely including the Visigoths, had embraced Arian Christianity. That was the version of Christianity. Remember, we talked about all these Christological debates. Arian Christianity thought that Jesus is subordinate to God. Of course, and it makes sense in a highly patriarchal society, it makes sense that people could get on board with a notion that the son is subordinate to the father. That seems to be the natural order of things, how things work. In some ways, it is more striking, perhaps, that what becomes embraced by all these church councils as official doctrine is the oneness of the Trinity, and the refusal theologically to subordinate one to the other in the God the Father and the Holy Spirit. Now, the Merovingian dynasty was, with the support of the local Gallo-Roman Christian elite, expand its authority into southern France. Clovis conquered lands south, so by his death, he rules over a territory which is mostly modern France. He is a flash in the pan, however. His dynastic line remained in power, but the next centuries were fairly, they were bloody, and while Clovis did have the law code written down in Latin, they often get called being do-nothing kings, not that ambitious, and as a result are something of a flash in the pan. Each time a king died, it triggered a crisis and a war. Lacking any clear principle of succession, that primogeniture is not yet established. Primogeniture is the notion that the oldest son takes over power when the father dies. And that doesn't get established until about 1000. So when the ruler died, any male of Merovingian blood could succeed to the throne, and so much fighting ensues. For a long time in the scholarship, these brutal centuries were referred to as the quintessential Dark Ages. However, more recent scholarship has developed a more complex view. For one, the notion that violence was not so much chaotic as a matter of course has gained some traction. And for example, a claimant had to prove himself worthy on the battlefield in order to be king. So violence wasn't necessarily an indication of disorder, but a process in which a contested order was determined, or as some scholars might put it, negotiated, even if violence. So kind of recognized use for violence as over a peaceful, orderly succession. In any case, the Merovingians remain kings for a few centuries, and then they get taken over, they get supplanted by the Carolingian dynasty. But in practice, they're supplanted before they actually lose the throne. That in the record, we have this Pepin, who was a mayor of the palace in the late 7th and early 8th century. He worked for the Merovingians, and his son, Charles Martel, is of this house of Carolus. And so now we have Carolingians emerging. They're still working for the Merovingians, but Charles Martel is famous for beating back the Umayyad dynasty in 732 at what's called the Battle of Poitiers, or Battle of Tours, took place somewhere between those two places in southwestern Europe. And so that he was the commander and leader in that battle. He was often successful in battle, successful as a ruler. His son is the Pepin the Short, and Pepin the Short officially usurps power from the Merovingians. And he does this by being recognized as the legitimate king by Pope Stephen. And Pepin the Short, his son is Charlemagne. And Charlemagne goes on to create a memorable and remarkable dynasty that historians have written many books about, and he left much trace. So let's talk about Charlemagne. But first, I want to make two points. First, Charles Martel, who is the grandfather of Charlemagne, when he dies, he has multiple sons, and he divides his reign between his two sons. That was normal at the time. Charlemagne as well, he only has one son, but between his progeny in the Treaty of Verdun, the territory that the royal family possesses is divided between the sons. That we are not yet seeing the practice of primogeniture, but we'll talk about that. And the other thing I want to point out is that under Pepin, we have the donation of Pepin. So so the Pope is being attacked by these people called the Lombards. And Rome has had lots of trouble. The Pope has had, the government of Rome has all but collapsed, and the papacy, as we talked about under Gregory the Great, has taken on many of the functions of government. And they continue to have security issues. And the Pope in the 8th century is facing attacks and encroachments by the Lombards. And the Pope asks the Franks to the north for military assistance against the Lombards. This is a big shift because before that, the papacy looked to Constantinople for assistance, the more powerful Eastern Empire. But Constantinople is also fighting its own wars, is being chipped away by Muslim encroachment in its reign, and it's not in the same position that it once was to send military help. And so the papacy needs to get creative. It looks north to these Frankish warlords and kings that are seem to be quite capable, and asks for help. And they do deliver. Pepin comes down with an army, defeats some warlords. He defeats the Lombards, and he gives land that the Lombards had conquered in the Italian peninsula to the Pope. And this is known as the donation of Pepin. He gives the Pope the territory that he's taken from the Lombards. And on this map right here, you see a map of Italy, and the orange land is land that the Lombards had claimed. And Pepin's donation, at least, includes this land around Rome that becomes the land of the Papal States. Now, this is really, I'm telling you all this, and this is really important because it lays the groundwork for one of the biggest hoaxes in Western European history. And that hoax is the donation of Constantine. What's the donation of Constantine? The donation of Constantine is the idea that Emperor Constantine, that way back from the Edict of Milan Constantine, had donated to the Pope in Rome the imperial crown, the cloak, the rank, and the rank along with Rome and the Western Empire. So the donation of Constantine is this idea that the Pope had received his imperial authority and land on which the Papal States are standing from Constantine. Now, this theory is, people have said, well, why? Well, there's a little bit of, we don't have unanimous consensus among historians on this, but one going interpretation is that it's a very convenient story for elevating the papacy. It could be useful in promoting the idea that the Pope isn't beholden to a barbarian Frank for the territory he holds. And so in the second half of the 8th century, this notion of the donation of Constantine starts appearing in the historical record. The chancellery of Otto III, the Ottonians that come after Charlemagne, his government clerks reject that. They say, this isn't a thing. We don't know what you're talking about. But nonetheless, it continues to be talked about. And by the time Pope Leo is writing letters back to Constantinople in the early 11th century, he writes to the Patriarch of Constantinople like it's a thing. And it's largely accepted that it's a thing. And they have, and documents exist that it's a thing. Here we have a fresco written, this is a fresco that is drawn memorializing this moment when the Emperor Constantine in the 300s donated the lands to Pope Sylvester. Remember that he's the one that wouldn't come himself to the Council of Nicaea. This is a 13th century fresco, so painted in the 1200s. The thing is, the donation of Constantine was a hoax, but it wasn't revealed to be a hoax, a forgery. Constantine never gave these lands to the Pope in Rome. The documents that said he did were an entire forgery. But it wasn't discovered that they were a forgery until the 15th century, until 1440s, when a Renaissance Italian, Lorenzo Valla, he published his discourse on the forgery of the alleged donation of Constantine, in which he enumerated the large number of historical anachronisms that pervaded the work. For instance, this document referred to Byzantia as the province, when in the 4th century it was only a city. And he picked out he did textual analysis. So he read this text and placed it into his context and said, this, and this doesn't add up. And he showed definitively that the donation of Constantine was a hoax. Some people had been skeptical about it for centuries, but in a way, I'm fast forwarding because we're going to get to the early modern period. We're going to talk about the Renaissance and some of the animating impulses that drove people there. And so that's just a little bit of a preview that it is a Renaissance demonstration that this donation of Constantine was a forgery. It's important to study the documents, is the historian's lesson here. And before we move on from that, I will just show you. Here's a 15th century picture of the donation of Constantine, drawn by the Renaissance artist Raphael. So we'll return to this. We'll talk about the donation of Constantine and the context that produced that analysis and expose that forgery when we talk about the Renaissance. But right now, let's come back into the 8th, 9th century and talk about the Carolingians. So we had Pepin the Younger donating. His son, Charlemagne, rules from 768 to 814. And he is, and we consider his rule quite important. There's this touchy moment of the Franco-Papal alliance when he is crowned, when Charlemagne goes to Rome and is crowned by the Pope on Christmas Day in the year 800. And in some ways, it creates this dynamic, it illustrates for us this tension that we will see obtaining throughout the medieval era about the relationship between church and state. It's said that Charlemagne was dismayed by being crowned by the Pope, in the sense that it suggests a sort of subordination. At the same time, the church in 800 is is a stable, powerful, legitimate, seen as legitimate institution. And so to have the support of the papacy confers a lot of legitimacy. So it's a complicated story, and the crowning of Charlemagne in a church, supposedly, some people say maybe it didn't even happen this way, but that crowning in 800 in some ways manifests a major tension that we find throughout the medieval the medieval period. So, and then the other thing I want you to know about Charlemagne is the Carolingian Renaissance, the real effort that he makes to promote, support, propagate culture, as he is working to create a more robust state authority. And the Treaty of Verdun is the treaty subsequent to him, where even under his grandsons, not his son, in his grandsons, 843, where the kingdom over which he had ruled is divided 3 ways. Here is an old manuscript illustration of his supposed coronation by the Pope on Christmas Day, 800, in Rome. Now, one thing to say about Charlemagne is that he's a perfect example of this medieval synthesis that we've talked to. He's of a Germanic tradition. He embraces Christianity and promotes Christianity, and he also draws on that authority of the Greco-Roman tradition. He goes down to Rome and invokes some of that memory and symbolism. Now, as a governor, as a ruler, in terms of governing, Charles assumes authority over the Franks. He extends his conquests into the northeast against the Saxons. He actually conquers some Muslims in northern Spain. He invades Italy. He conquers the Lombards again. They acted up. He does this in the name, as had been established under Pepin, of helping the Pope. So he is, and the popes are increasingly finding that, for our security needs, Constantinople can't do much, but this northern relationship is working out well for us. So that's how we start to see this increasingly imbricated relations of Rome and the Frankish rulers to the north, culminating in this Charlemagne even going south to Rome and being crowned by Leo III. Now, so here we have Charlemagne, Germanic king, calling himself a Roman emperor and crowned by a Latin Christian pope. This, in a nutshell, is what we mean when we say medieval synthesis. The idea of Roman rule remains, even though in practical terms it's been gone for a while. The reality is vastly changed, and Charlemagne starts to create a government. He travels around, he starts to keep more records, doing the types of things that government does, for which he's sometimes been even called the father of Europe. And some historians say, are we seeing here the last Roman subkingdom or the birth of a new sort of civilization? So we give Charlemagne credit for the Carolingian Renaissance. What is the Carolingian Renaissance? Well, in his reign, he supports learning. He creates this court of Aachen where he brings scholars and scribes and artists. He actually even has some art removed from the previous like post-Roman capital in Ravenna, northern Italy. He brought to Aachen and kind of re-established and placed there at his court. He promotes art, he promotes architecture, he has scribes even developed a Carolingian script that will become a basis for the basis of a more modern alphabet. And here's a picture of it. It's Carolingian minuscule. Now we're talking about, when we're talking about scribes copying something in a royal court, we're very much talking about an elite phenomenon. This doesn't touch so many lives in an immediate sense, but it's hugely important because it is during Charlemagne's reign and at his court that much copying, a good biblical exegetical texts, as well as texts from the classical world, they get copied and they get preserved for subsequent generations. Here is another, so here's another example of Carolingian minuscule. We have a 10th century Vulgate Gospel of Luke, and here the book of Exodus being copied. I want to actually, thinking about texts and sources, I want to stop and make a little bit of a digression talking about Bible translations. And so I'm going to throw up here a bunch of kind of a list. On this slide, there's a whole lot to look at of scripture and biblical translations. So the Hebrew scripture is probably finalized in the centuries, 7th to 5th centuries. Hebrew scripture gets finalized. The Torah is very early on translated from Hebrew into Greek and Aramaic. The New Testament is written in Koine Greek. The four Gospels, at least, that were written between the 70s and 90s of the First Common Era. And then Jerome, one of our important Latin church fathers, he translates the Bible into Latin. The Bible was not originally written in Latin. Jerome translates the Bible into Latin, and that becomes known as the Vulgate Bible. From there will be a variety of translation projects. Ulfius, who lives in the 4th century, he translates into Gothic, the Gothic language, the New Testament. Some barbarians had been nominally Christian since even the 300s and then the 400s. And Saint Ulfius, he devised a Gothic script and translated the New Testament into that language. These people, the church is going to see as heretics, though. They subscribe to the Arian faith, not the Latin faith, not the proper orthodoxy. And before 1054, officially, it's kind of one Christian faith with Arianism and Nestorianism and some other misdirected sects that these councils say, nope, they're out. And St. Ulfius, writing for the Gothic, translating in the 4th century into the New Testament into a Gothic script, is writing for an Arian Christian audience, we might say. Now, translations in the 5th century, 5th, 6th century are made of if not the whole Bible, and often it isn't the whole Bible. Maybe they'll just do the gospel first, get the books you need to say a mass. They'll be made into Armenian, Georgian, Coptic, Ethiopian, Cyril and Methodius, Greek monks who went into Eastern Europe and devised an alphabet in the 9th century that would end up becoming the basics of the Cyrillic alphabet. They're doing their work in the 9th century, even though a complete translation of the Bible into Old Church Slavonic isn't going to come around until the 15th century. Back in Western Europe, Bede the Venerable translated some of the Gospel into English, and Charlemagne brings to his court Alcuin, who revises the Bible at Charlemagne's court. He revises the Bible at Charlemagne's court. Up in England, the King Alfred the Great is going to have some parts of the Bible translated into English in the 10th century. Not a full translation. But now, I mention all of this to you, all this translation work into other languages going on for these centuries, because in the Middle Ages, the church is going to come around to discouraging translations. And in 1199, Pope Innocent III bans translations of the Bible. This idea being so much can get lost in translation, it becomes the job that priests need to know Latin, and the extent to which they know Latin, we'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture, is really up to question. It's a bit of a toss-up. But the church decides that it is uncomfortable with a whole lot of translation work, and in order to keep the theology correct and straight, it discourages, and then even in 1199 bans translations of the Bible. That's why, again, to kind of preview to later in our course when we're talking about the Reformation in the early modern period, Martin Luther's act of translating the Bible into German is a subversive act. And the King James Bible, which now is so frequently used, that was a Protestant act of translating the Bible into English in the 17th century. So that's a little bit of a digression, just thinking about texts, how they're preserved, and what this work of translation accomplishes over time. Now, the Carolingian Empire that Charlemagne constituted is going to fall apart under his grandsons. He had done work to keep records, but there's a lack of infrastructure. And this is still very much a world where a king, the government at some level is the king, moving around from place to place with a few scribes that are maybe having scrolls or whatnot, as opposed to having a central place. Although his court at Aachen is very much a central place. But overall, there's a lack of infrastructure. And so under his grandsons, and it's divided up among Charles, Lothar, and Louis the German, the empire that Charlemagne constituted devolves. And this period, 850 to 1000, is what is quite frequently known as Dark Ages. It is a period of political fragmentation. Power is devolving into the hands of local elites. The society is agriculturally based. The mass of agricultural laborers are not under the authority of the state or even free individual farmers, but they're under the authority of local landlords in the manorial system, which we'll talk about later. They are serfs. That means that they are dependent on these lords for access to any sort of public justice. They pay rents in kind. They're bound to the land, although formally they're not kind of slaves in person, they're serfs. It's a different designation, but it is in many ways an unfree labor. Now, anyone who came along in the year 1050 would have taken a look at this post-Carolingian Frankish world of Western Europe, and they would have seen the backward end of Eurasia. Compared with the Islamic world, the Abbasid Empire, with its tremendous efflorescence of culture, the biggest with this massive library in Cordoba, Spain, Europe was an underdeveloped, rural, intellectually unsophisticated backwater. But in the long term, this medieval synthesis of Western Europe would make a dramatic impact on Byzantium, the Islamic world, and by the end of our class, the globe at large. And with that, I'll wrap up. See you next time.